Well, good evening. We're glad you're here. Go ahead and get your seats. And I apologize again. I'm traveling. I'm in Tennessee right now doing a entrepreneurship program for disabled U.S. veterans from our armed forces. And so had thought about doing a Tuesday night study and switching nights, but my flight could get delayed coming back on Tuesday. I would hate to find out that I'm not going to get into Santa Barbara on time to get over here to teach in the evening. So easiest thing to do is just have it be on a regular time, Monday night, and have it recorded, and that way everybody normally comes on Monday. So this is July 17th, and we are again doing apologetics. As always, the interest here is to do as Paul did up on the Areopagus there in Greece, in Athens, to take on the skeptics in a meaningful, thoughtful, logical, and rational dialogue. And that's what I always like to do. And again, if you're a first-timer, apologetics, that term comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a verbal defense. And it comes from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, talking about having a reasoned argument or a legal defense for the hope or the expectation that's within us. I apologize, in our last session, going through the Bible manuscripts, part 2, I think I hit a forward on my key a little too quick, and we skipped this slide. And so I wanted to make sure you saw it. It's in the notes that are at the website. But this is the Isaiah scroll that was found in Qumran, and they've moved it now into Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. And what an amazing museum to go to. And as you walk around this huge cylinder, they have the entire scroll rolled out, and you can look at it end to end. It's illumined from behind with some lighting and so forth. But that was a slide we just skipped accidentally because I clicked the button too quickly, I think. So for tonight, let's do a quick summary kind of status update of where we are here in session 5. We've covered so far worldview, and we looked at a biblical worldview and a naturalistic worldview as we've kind of settled on. And side by side, there are really 3 key issues that we're talking about here. Number one, our sessions 2 and 3 were then about the universe and earth and life, and the biblical Christian worldview sees it as finely tuned, lots and lots of design, and so there must be a designer creator outside of the natural world, and that there's been purpose and intention in the creation. Whereas the naturalist says, oh no, everything is under natural law, it's all uniformitarian, evolution-based, given enough time, anything can happen, and we looked at that multiple times, and that everything we see is random and accidental, which means that there is no purpose, there is no intent. And that's going to have an impact for tonight, because as we talk about absolute truth and relative truth, if everything around us just happened by accident, there's no purpose, there's no intent, there's no design, there's no rationale underlying it all, then what is there with regard to truth? What is there with regard to morals and so forth? So we'll look at that this evening. The second area, of course, is then how could the creator-designer communicate with the creation? And the first we call general revelation, or in a general sense, he communicates through everything that's been made, and that testifies of his incredible power, design, creativity, intention, and then there can also be specific revelation right through the Bible. And we covered that for 2 weeks on could the Bible then in fact be that medium for his speaking to mankind. Whereas the naturalist says, well, there's really nothing to transmit because there is no transmitter or source. If there is no God, there's nothing that needs to be communicated. So the Bible is nothing more than a bunch of writers who wrote some poetry and some philosophical thoughts and things like that, but there's nothing communicated specifically from the Creator. And then finally, the issue of truth, which we'll look at this evening. Is there then absolute truth? Can the designer-creator communicate specifics about that, and that these truths are axioms, true things that do not change over time? Whereas the naturalistic worldview would say, well, there really isn't so much truth. Truth is kind of relative, and things change over time as we become more enlightened, as we do more scientific research, as mankind continues to evolve and expand and think about things differently. And so, again, you can see how these two worldviews are diametrically opposed to one another with regard to this topic. So that's our segue for getting in tonight. How do sessions 4 and 5 on the biblical basis for the Bible being a sound source, that it is infallible, that it's inerrant, that it's able to communicate effectively to mankind. How does the Bible then segue into this idea of truth? Well, numerous evidences seem to validate that the Bible is both reliable and accurate in its communication method about God. We looked at several of the key decision areas, the key factors that contribute to a great case for the Bible being designed from outside of just man's thoughts. And so the logical next question then is there such a thing as absolute truth? And questions that go with that are, does the designer, creator, God, have any clear truths that need to be communicated to us? What is meant by this term relative truth? And could the Bible then be a source of truth for mankind? So let's take a look. When we think about truth, there was an old show when I was a little kid back in the 1960s called Truth or Consequences, a game show on TV. And there was another show also you might remember sponsored by Geritol, To Tell the Truth. And they'd have 3 people come up in front and get questions asked of them and so forth. And at the end, the panel would try to figure out which person was telling the truth. You might remember Lily Tomlin's character from Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, Edith Ann, and of course she always ended her statements with, "And that's the truth." And of course she did a nice little raspberry after that. The X-Files was an interesting phenomenon, big in the movie and on TV as well. And the idea was that, the truth is out there. We're waiting to find out the truth because the government knows it, but the rest of the folks don't know it and so forth. I remember the Tony Hedley's band from the 1980s, Spandau Ballet, had a great song, a big hit called True. And it always talked about this much is true. And but again, that was also in a relative context as well. But and of course, we can't, from pop culture, talk about truth without taking a look at Jack Nicholson's character in A Few Good Men, as Colonel Jessup is on the stand, and the JAG attorney from the Navy, Tom Cruise, is pressuring him as to whether or not he ordered the code red. And he's saying, I want you to tell me the truth. And of course, the classic line from the witness is, "You can't handle the truth." And as believers, I'd like to say we can handle the truth because we have it in God's Word. So absolute truth is inherently always the same. It's timeless, regardless of persons, cultures, parameters, location, opinions, time in history. It's truth. There may be adjustments in culture and society and how people think of things and philosophical underpinnings, but the truth is still the truth. So then comes this classic example. There are many of these if you have a philosophy class in college or something. I know we dealt with this many times with my philosophy professor, but here's a great one. That painting at the Louvre, as you're there at the Musée d'Orsay looking at the Impressionists, and you say, that painting is just beautiful. And then the question comes down to, though, but is that relative? And so this raises the idea that there could be what's called relative truth. But I'm in the camp very firmly that relative truth, by definition, is an oxymoron. If it's relative to something, then it's not a standalone truth. You can have relative opinion, relative perspective, but you can't have relative truth. Conditional subjective, based on circumstances, changes over time. Therefore, it's not a truth. It's really more popular opinion. Or it's, like I said, a matter of perspective or personal preference. And so relativism essentially does come out and say that there really is no such thing as an absolute truth. That's the key to being a relativist. So when we asked, what about that beautiful painting at the Musée d'Orsay or at the Louvre or somewhere else, they would say about the painting, somebody could say, well, gee, my opinion is that painting is awful. And I've done that before. I've gone into galleries before and somebody's raving about a certain artist, and I'm kind of like, I don't really like his stuff, or I don't like the way she does that. And so they would like to use that as an argument for, see, that just goes to show you that everybody has a different opinion about whether that painting is beautiful or not. But that opens up what's called the door for what we call situational ethics. Based upon current or unique context that we happen to be in, there is no longer a universal truth. Societal morality changes through the years, the decades, the centuries, and the millennia as opinions shift and so forth. So truth cannot be relative to meaning. That painting can't be absolutely true about its beauty because of what it means to me or what it means to another person. That's our personal preference or whether we like something or not. But the question about truth is not subject in that same manner. It's inherently subjective when you do it that way, and it varies person to person. That is relativism in its epitome of its definition. And so we're looking, though, for absolute truth, things that are true irrespective of what you think about or have a preference for. So, for instance, scientific theories are developed to explain observable phenomenon. Over time, a theory, not yet disproved, could be viewed by everybody as, oh, this is true. This is truth. However, is it then a fact? And that, again, becomes subject to, well, this is where the scientific community happens to be on this topic in this stage of time and research and devices and so forth for measurement. Theories are checked, tested, substantiated over time, but at some point, they could be disproven. That means they're no longer true, they're no longer fact. Let me give you a couple of examples of how relativism works in science. Just a couple examples. Pluto is our 9th planet. Up until 2006, that was a truth. That was a fact. It was a scientific basis for that. But of course, it all changed when the decision was made that it's not a planet. It doesn't have the characteristics to be included any longer. So now we only have 8 planets in our solar system. In 1650, the Earth was 4,000 years old. That was the understanding. By the time you get to 1788, under Charles Hutton, they were experimenting with the idea that the Earth is infinitely old. There's no way to put a time on it. And yet just less than 100 years later, about 80 years later, Lord Kelvin, doing some measurements about heat loss and so forth, pegged the Earth as being 98 million years old. But he himself, just 35 years later, doing continuous experiments and so forth, had to downgrade that to 20 to 40 million years. And I always love to see that. Oh, it's between 20 million and 40 million, as if it's between like 20 feet or 40 feet for my measurement in my yard or for the carpeting in a house or something like that. 20 million to 40 million is a ridiculous large range. And to just put it out there that that's how old the Earth is, having just 35 years earlier said it's 98 million years old. By 1919, the world was 1.6 billion years old. Hubble, in 1919, said the universe is 2 billion years old, but the problem was they had data that they were starting to show from geologists based on rock sediments and so forth and the way they were doing aging of rocks and so forth. They said, well, the Earth is 3 billion years, and yet Hubble was saying that the universe is 2 billion years old. So we already had this kind of conflict going on, and that's just only about 104 years ago. Think about that. Then the universe was 6 billion years old, according to Walter Beatty, and that was in 1952. He took Hubble's constant and did some new tweaking of it and said, oh, no, it's much lower. The Hubble constant has to be much lower. So the universe is actually 6 billion years old. And then Alan Sandage in 1958, just 6 years later, further reduced the Hubble constant, made it lower even again, which increased the universe to between 15 and 20 billion years. And again, when you think about that, 15 to 20 billion years, a 5 billion year variation. I mean, do you know how long 5 billion years is? And of course, today, if you go to the NASA websites and so forth in 2023, the universe, as we've looked at before, is 13.8 billion years. And they believe that the plus or minus variation on that is really small because of their instruments and the advances they've made. But you can see how this is a relative truths that have shifted and changed over time. So then what about this? We looked at the Bible for the last 2 weeks. Exodus 20, verse 16, has a statement that says you should only speak the truth. That's one of the basic mandates for how to behave, how to live, is you shall not lie. You shall only tell the truth. And yet it's interesting, when we go to court and give testimony in a legal case, why is it that we still need to swear an oath before giving legal testimony? See, if everybody always spoke the truth, then when you come and give testimony at the courtroom, you would just sit down and begin giving your testimony. But because we understand human nature as revealed in the scriptures, we understand that people have an incentive to either not tell the whole truth or to just outright lie, or to be asked about something and to say, I don't remember at all, and yet of course they remember. Or even worse, to say, I'm going to claim the Fifth Amendment, which protects me from incriminating myself. And notice, of course, not only why is it that we have to do an oath to, in essence, guarantee, now you are going to tell the truth right now, right? But on top of that, what do we want you to do? We want you to put your hand on the Bible, and we want you to swear the oath that you're going to tell the truth. Now, many courtrooms across the country and around the world have removed the Bible from having your hand on that. Now you just stand and put your hand up like this and say, I pledge to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Some would have your hand on the Bible and finish that oath with, so help me God. And so it's really interesting to think that, I think there's a lot of oxymoron going here as well. It's kind of an interesting issue here that we want to have somebody tell the truth, and yet we have to ask them to swear an oath that they're going to tell the truth. And it used to be your hand is on the Bible, and you finished it by saying, I swear, in essence, so help me God. Our founding fathers, in formally declaring their independence from England, the Continental Congress wrote this into the Declaration. We hold these two truths to be not just something we came up with, but they're self-evident. All men are created equally, and they are, notice the wording here, they're endowed by their Creator with these certain unalienable rights. And those three rights are to have life, to have freedom, to be liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think it's amazing that our nation is founded on these two biblical principles. That's why when somebody loves to say, our nation was not founded as a Christian nation in any way. Well, our Declaration of Independence draws very specifically on unalienable rights that we have, and those come from the Scriptures. Here's another basis for us as we think about truth and so forth. I'm always drawn to Harvard University's seal. You can see the original one here. Notice how it says 3 Bibles or 3 books are opened, and they say Veritas. And in 1636, it was founded in Massachusetts. There were more than 17,000 Puritans living in the Commonwealth at that time. And the college was founded primarily for the purpose of educating new clergy. And veritas is the Latin for truth. You think in French it's vérité, in Spanish it's verdad, and so forth. So it's all about pursuing truth. And as you can see, all the instruction in that day was in Latin. You can even see how Harvard's name is also written in its Latin format. And so instruction was in Latin. You had to know Latin from your early education during your junior high teen years and so forth before entering Harvard. And you get to 1643, 7 years after its founding, there's this interesting booklet that's out called the New England First Fruits. And here's a quote from it regarding this college that's been started in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the quote is, "To advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity," meaning to keep it going perpetually for our future generations. Dreading that we would ever leave an illiterate ministry, and that's not a typo, that's a direct quote in how they spelled it in those days, but it was the idea that there would be a void, if you will. We would leave dreading an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall be lying in the dust. And so they viewed it in that statement about Harvard that we are training young men for the ministry to pursue truth, veritas. Now you fast forward here to the 21st century, Here's the Harvard seal today. Thankfully, it still has Veritas and the 3 books open. They no longer consider those to be the Bible opened up. Those are different philosophical books and science textbooks and things that give us knowledge. But here's a quote, and think of how different this is from its founding, and how this reflects kind of the woke, revisionist mentality of 2023 that we live in today. Exposure to new ideas, new ways of understanding, and new ways of knowing. Students will embark on a journey of intellectual transformation through a diverse living environment where students live with people who are studying different topics, who come from different walks of life, and notice the last one, and have evolving identities. And the language in there was so perfectly wordsmithed and crafted to reflect all of the current politically correct culture of the day. And yet there's really nothing in there. I'm always reminded of David Horowitz, the political conservative commentator, always says, never let your kids go to college and major in anything that ends in the word studies. And so I always think that's great, because what he's getting at is, you study a topic, but some of these other things that have been created, and this just reads, again, new ideas, new ways of knowing, a journey of intellectual transformation. They have the term, of course, diverse living environment. Students are studying different topics, coming from different walks of life, and there's that evolving identity over time. So again, think how relative truth has now replaced a former truth that was based on Scripture and so forth. So let's do a couple of little arguments here as we go through this idea. And again, we only have an hour, so we can't cover every possible topic. I'd love to. But here's a few for you as you think about having a discussion with somebody about truth. Is it possible to know, the skeptic says, what is true? Because there's really no such thing as truth. And so here's the first dialogue. There's a problem with that particular rationale. Let's give you a dialogue one. We're going to do 4 dialogues tonight. The first one is, I start off by saying, spitting on people when you're walking around in public, that's just wrong. You can't walk down the street and just start spitting on people every time you see someone. That's just wrong. But technically, a relativist would say, well, says who? Who says it's wrong? And I would say, well, everybody knows you don't do that. You don't walk down and spit on people. But the response is, well, that's fine for you, but try not to impose your beliefs onto me. And what it's doing, again, is saying, my belief is relative. It's not an absolute. So I would respond and say, are you saying there's no such thing as an absolute truth? And then here's where they get in trouble. They say, that's exactly what I'm saying. There is no such thing as an absolute truth. My response would then be, but that statement that you just made inherently is your absolute truth. You're actually holding on to an axiom that says there's no such thing as truth, and you're making that your basis. So it's illogical, even impossible, for relativism to state any kind of a basis or a rule, because as soon as they do, they've disproved relativism. Does that make sense? Let's look at a second dialogue. My moral actions are based on a belief in God and the Bible. And yet the skeptic looks at me and says, well, you know what, wait a minute. People are free to believe or not believe. There are no absolute morals. So my response is, so whatever you do is fine for you, but what if it hurts somebody? What if it hurts others? And then they kind of relent and say, okay, I'll concede. People can do whatever they want as long as it doesn't hurt others. But then my response, wait a minute. Isn't that then a universal basis you're stating, to not hurt others? If people hurt others, haven't they violated that universal basis? And then they respond with, of course, well, they just need to stay in line with societal norms or the mores of what's going on in society. And my question again then would be, but why? Have these then become an absolute truth for living? So either the societal norms and mores, or the statement that, well, you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. Those are illogical and impossible, because relativism, again, states a basis that ultimately then disproves it. So classic relativism might say something like this: what's true for you may not be true for others. And I'll give you a couple examples of some axioms, some pure absolute truths. How many sides are there in a triangle? It's always 3. By definition. Can't have more, can't have less. How many degrees are in a sphere? 360 degrees. How many sides to a square? There are 4. Water boils always at the temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit. But then you get to some of these kind of statements. The birth sex, the sex you have at your birth. Well, I put it in gray here because today it's now referred to as, well, that can change later. It may not even be binary. You might have a non-binary approach to what you think about sex. Interesting. I thought, I was there at the birth of my 4 children. We didn't do gender reveals at the 4th or 5th month of pregnancy. We did a gender reveal there in the delivery room. I was the one that got the baby and looked and said, oh, it's a boy, oh, it's a girl. And so, yet we're being told today, oh, that can change. And it might not even be binary, which is male, female, the 2 choices. What about a baby in the womb? Today, the question now is it a person? Well, I don't know. I've looked at some amazing ultrasound photography of my grandchildren, my 3 daughters or my daughter-in-law when they've been pregnant, and taking a look, and I just am amazed. See little hand and fingers and toes and the knees up in the air and the head. You can see their eyes and their nose. And yet we're actually saying, well, is it a person really? And yet we would say, well, wait a minute. As an absolute truth, of course it's a human being in there. But again, relativism says, well, how do you know that? What about shoplifting? How about shoplifting in San Francisco? Proposition 47 says if it's under $950, it's no longer a felony. It's just a misdemeanor. And we don't have enough police officers, and we don't have enough attorneys in the district attorney's office to prosecute all these. So pretty much if you're stealing something under $950, you can probably come in, take it, and leave, and no one's going to stop you. And a lot of stores have actually stopped operating in San Francisco because of so much theft, because this proposition's in place. And yet, taking something from the store, walking out the door with it, not paying for it, is always stealing. But we've created a new category of kind of a relativist way of seeing that. What about burning our American flag? We just had our 4th of July celebration last week. It's sad to think that in 1989, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to rule that you can burn the American flag. In fact, that's your protected free speech. And I just cringed when that ruling came down. And I remember thinking to myself, how is it that something as sacred as our national identity is reflected in the flag of our country and the freedoms and the men and women who served to bring about those freedoms and the founding fathers and so forth, that you could burn that, and yet that's considered an act of protected free speech. So ethics, the question comes down, is there one way to think or act that is always true? And yet today we have these 2 statements which are not actually the same statement. The first statement is there's a right way to think or to act, and has embedded in it the inference of irrespective of the circumstance or the situation or the people involved or the culture or the time on history or something like that. There is a right way to think or act, and that's what you want to train your kids in, the right thing to do. But it almost sounds the same, but look at the second statement. Is there a best way to think or to act? And that infers that given the situation, what's your best decision? And best and right are actually not the same thing, and that's what happens in the problem of ethics. Here's a book. I brought one of my favorite books along with me, The Ethical Imperative by John Della Costa. I used to use this with my students when I taught undergrad and MBA students. And we would take a look at this, and interestingly enough, the book, as you see the subtitle, Why Moral Leadership is Good Business. It's as if you had to make a case that if you were moral in your leadership, it's actually good for your business. And I think that's really interesting, because should there not be an absolute moral basis to define ethical actions and thoughts? Should not all business be ethical? Shouldn't you always do the right thing? Not the best thing given the situation, the right thing. Here's another book by Bob Jackal. Used this for about, maybe 15, 20 years in a senior seminar program and also for graduating MBA students. And it's called Moral Mazes, The World of Corporate Managers. And the term mazes, I don't know about you, but the reason the book is provocative is that title. The term mazes connotes that it's not such a clear route that you can navigate. that there are these moral mazes. It's not a straight line on doing the right thing, but you may have to navigate to do the best thing given the situation. Situations will present difficult decisions. There are all kinds of case studies in here about how to do that. That prompted me to think about the term that we use for the past 2 millennia, which is referred to in ethics as the Judeo-Christian ethics. It's always directly, when you hear that term, it's always code for what? A biblical basis for how to live, how to make decisions. It's a Judeo-Christian ethic. What's the Judeo-Christian common thread? It's the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Bible is a widely recognized basis for truth. Notice it's never a Hindu ethic or a Buddhist ethic, an Islamic ethic, a Zoroastrian ethic, and certainly never an atheistic ethic. Okay, it's always a Judeo-Christian ethic. That's the basis for doing the right thing. The world also always refers to the concept called living by the golden rule, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. But once again, that's directly referring to a biblical basis for living. So when people talk about the golden rule, they're not talking about something that a guy just made up one day. They're talking about a basis for living, an absolute right way to do things, drawn from the scriptures. And we're going to touch on that in more detail in a couple slides. Now, here's another book. This goes all the way back to 1997. My gosh, I can't believe that was 23 years ago. I did this book called Entrepreneurial Ethics, Values and Decision-Making in Successful New Ventures. And what I did is I did a survey of 400 randomly selected entrepreneurs whose companies had been listed on the Inc. magazine top 500 fastest growing companies in the United States. And the listings were for 1991 to 1996. I went back to each year, got those databases, contacted them, created a pledge of confidentiality so they would know that none of their answers or responses would be singled out. I would be the only one that would see the responses, and they would only be part of a larger database from which we would draw inferences and do some regression analyses and so forth to kind of take a look at how top entrepreneurs from the top growth companies do things, and are there any ethics involved. And of course, we made the decision also to go with kind of a black and white, cut and dry. Isn't that interesting that the right thing to do is when we think of it as, oh, it's black and white. I've heard people say to me, oh, Dave, you see everything is just very cut and dry, very much straightforward. What about those gray areas? And that euphemism, that colloquialism of a gray area is when the black and the white blend together. It's not so cut and dry as a distinct line, but it's more of a gray area. Let me give you a couple examples of what I found in my research back in the mid-90s. It really gave rise to this idea of situational ethics, supported that. Here's the percentages of the entrepreneurs who made statements that my original forecasts that I presented to investors were actually inaccurate. I knew that going in. Look at that, almost half. Corporate culture does not need to be unified as an ethical basis. That's like 4 out of 10, 2 out of 5, 40% of the entrepreneurs felt this way. Only include positive information when you're doing periodic investor updates. So never volunteer negative information, only include positive stuff. Over a third of them said that's what they do. More than a third, it's okay to use overly positive but unrealistic expectations. So we call that in the ethics field touting, the idea that you might add a lot to something, embellish something when you're presenting to investors and so forth, making it look better than it is. Another third said it's okay to back out of a verbal agreement if you get a better deal. So they viewed even a signed agreement, some would say they back out of that, but a verbal oral arrangement where you shake hands on this oral agreement, interestingly, a third of them said it's okay to back out if you got a better deal. And almost a third said it's okay to have a different management style in-house than you do out in public when you're in view. 24% don't volunteer any information to investors. They always just say, let the investors ask for it. So the idea is, I'm not going to be volunteering stuff about what's going on in here. We'll wait to be asked. And if they don't ask, we don't tell. About 1 in 5 said, focus only on positive information. 12%, that's 1 out of every 8, said it's okay to never volunteer negative information. It's okay to never bring that up. And these are the 2 I put in red. There were many like this, but these 2 definitely jumped out at me. 8%. So out of 400, 8% would be 32 of them said it's okay to overestimate a sales forecast. when you're presenting to your investors and to other clients and so forth. And 3% actually said it's okay to alter financial statements in order to secure a funding deal, meaning actually go into the profit and loss statement or go into the balance sheet and change the numbers in order to secure a deal. Now, it's a tiny percentage, but think about that. 3 out of 400, that's 12 entrepreneurs out of 400 thought that that was okay. Here's another dialogue for our skeptic and the person standing on truth. Let's get dinner at La Petite Chaise. Such an amazing French cuisine. I love their restaurant. And the other person says, oh, not for me. I don't like French food. I prefer Greek moussaka with lamb. And then they turn and they go, see, this is my point. Truth for you is different than for me. We can't both be right. But where are we at again? We're back to those preferences or personal perspective. So I then say, so you're saying truth is about perception and personal preferences? That's truth, if you're going to use that as a basis. And then they say, well, let me believe what I like, and why don't you just believe what you like? And let's leave each other alone. You've heard that before, right? My response would be, but wait a minute, absolute truth is not based on one's perspective or personal preference. If something is absolutely true and you don't like it, you can choose not to believe it, but does your preference negate its inherent truthfulness? And that's the issue. I mean, it's almost like the speed limit on the freeway. I mean, that's the absolute basis. People get tickets for driving over the speed limit, and yet people are saying, yeah, but for me, and given my situation and what I'm doing right now, I feel like it's okay to speed or something like that. And again, it's always a relativist always finds him or herself trapped by making these kinds of statements because those statements actually infer that there is a basis for when you can do something or not do something. How many of you have heard about the Veritas Forum? This was started back at Harvard and then spread to many campuses around the country, and it uses that Harvard axiom called Veritas, which is their brand. And here at UCSB, there's been a Veritas Forum for, well over 25 or 30 years. I was on the board back in the 1990s with a couple of really great theologians and some other scholars and professors here in town. And we would actually put the program together each year to bring people to campus. And the mission was to sponsor high-level academic debates on key topics of absolute truth versus man's relative truth. And here's an example of just a more recent one where John Lennox from Oxford was brought in to do the Veritas Forum there at the University of Pennsylvania, and Christianity on Trial, is faith reasonable? And he does an outstanding job and so forth. So when you think about these kinds of forums, it's always interesting that Veritas, truth, is inferred, and yet we end up with, well, there are different ways of looking at things, so maybe it really isn't true. Cognitive logic, rational decision-making, higher-order reasoning, morality, these cannot simply arise from purely natural law, with mankind being the result of some random chance over billions of years. Why is it that we have higher-order thinking, morality, rational decision-making, cognitive logic that makes no sense unless we are actually created in a specific, intentional, purposeful manner? See, for instance, animals possess none of these competencies. I mean, some of you are going to argue that your bird or your little dog or your cat, well, maybe not cats. I think we all know cats don't have any kind of higher order reasoning or rationality of any kind, but certainly animals in the animal kingdom we know, they don't possess these kinds of things. You don't suddenly go out in the woods and on a hike and stumble across a bunch of rabbits who have a printing press set up and they're actually doing editorials and getting ready to send things out throughout the forest in terms of debates and creating kind of dissent among people and so forth. No, they're just living instinctually. The kingdom exists in a physical body with a consciousness or awareness. There's all kinds of studies you can look at on the size of different sizes of brains in various animals and so forth. And they have an inherent instinct that was given to them. And they do the same thing all the time. They know how to eat, they know how to have young, they know how to care for their young. Some just have young and walk away from them. I mean, it's very different in all the different species. However, animals do not and cannot function with abstract thinking. Yeah, you can do some training of animals to do some tricks and things like that. And there's, of course, all kinds of videos out there about apes who've been learned, over repetition and so where they can identify a few things and all. But they're not going to sit down and start having a conversation, start thinking about abstract thoughts, have cognitive logic, do rational thinking and reasoning and so forth. And certainly not going to have any basis for morality. And the scientists say that's okay because, again, in the naturalistic worldview, everything comes from random chance. There's no basis for how you live and how you act. But in the case of someone with an absolute truth as a basis, I would say, well, humans exist, number one, in a physical body. They also have a consciousness, but they also have this third unique spiritual dimension. And this is spoken of by Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5:23. We have a soma in the Greek, that's your physical body. We have a psyche, which is the mind or the consciousness. The term psychology, that's why it starts with a PSY. Psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, and that's your consciousness, your mind. But we also have a pneuma, and this pneuma is spirit. And that's what separates us from the animal kingdom. Man was uniquely created from dirt, separate from how the animal kingdom was just bursting forth. When you read the account, the world just brought forth the animals, and the sea started teeming with all kinds of fish and wildlife and so forth, and the birds of the air just filled the air and so forth. But man was intentionally designed, and if you read that account, first of all, man was created in our image, plural. And there's a hint there pointing to the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit present at creation. We're created in the image of God, our, plural. And then also a very distinct act took place where God breathed into Adam, having made him from dirt, breathed into him the pneuma, and he became a living spirit, a living soul. And so that's the difference in the creation process, a very unique, specific creation of mankind. And even more so, woman was uniquely created from man. So man's created from the dirt, woman was created from a part of the man. And the woman was designed from his body as a starting point. So very, very specific, intentional, purposeful creation with regard to men and women. And let me give you some other examples to consider here from the scriptures, and this will help us start to think as we wrap up here tonight about absolute truth. In Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 5, we're told very specifically that human beings were created either male or female. There's only two types. And when we did our sessions on worldview and we looked at the visible man, and I gave you all the data about the human body and so forth, there are only two types. And those two types are specifically designed to come together physically and be able to reproduce. It's how it was designed. There are only two. All animal life was also, though, created male and female. We're told that in Genesis 6. And in Genesis 7, when Noah goes onto the ark, two of every kind came, one male and one female, because the inherent understanding was that's an absolute truth. You need a male and a female to reproduce, to have more and more and repopulate the planet and so forth. So the scripture is very clear on that absolute truth, male and female, end of discussion. That's an absolute truth. Science clearly knows and understands there are only two biological sexes, male and female. There are no others. And like I said, I was present at the birth of my 4 children and did the gender reveal as the body came out, and I looked down and I said, hey, we have our little son, or hey, we have a daughter. And it was very clear, absolute truth. There wasn't kind of I'm not sure what we have. There was none of that going on. And yet relative truth would say gender is expression. It's a choice irrespective of your biological sex. Male or female is entirely subjective to your perspective, your own personal preference. This all comes under the heading of diversity and inclusivity. And they're all part of the larger umbrella of political correctness. And so now we have to deal with that in our society more and more so. I'll point you to an article from the January 28th, this current year, 2023. The Wall Street Journal had an article on various airlines around the world are starting to abolish the distinctive uniforms for male flight attendants and female flight attendants. And what they're saying now is that they can wear whichever uniform they'd like to in terms of how they like to express themselves. They even now have on their name tags their name, but underneath it, the pronouns they'd like to be perceived by and so forth. And so when you see kind of that woke revisionist history, the whole restating of gender and so forth, you recognize that this is being pushed into society, but it's presented as truth, but it's not truth. It's perspective. It's personal preference and so forth. How about this? Exodus chapter 20, an example of absolute truth. How should humans interact with one another? Well, there are 6 things given about how we should interact with one another. We should honor our father and mother. We shouldn't murder. We should remain faithful to our spouse. We should never steal. We should never lie. And we should never covet what others have. And I've often said to myself, from an absolute truth standpoint, these all make very good sense. They're logical. They're rational, very thoughtful. And I always say this, could you consider what life would be like on this planet if that's how everyone treated each other? Think about that. If we lived by those 6. Relative truth, on the other hand, says, well, generally speaking, those things are okay. But given certain circumstances and various loopholes to accommodate personal perspectives and preferences and so forth, the idea is they're saying that hard and fast truth is not really truth. Because again, if you've already made your initial decision, your bias that there is no God, you've rejected the Bible, so you just see, well, that's man's philosophy, somebody wrote that down, it's kind of nice. And if you want to live by that, that's great. But you would then respond by saying, so are you saying it's okay to murder somebody? And again, I'm not talking about a just war where you take up arms to defend your rights and liberty and so forth against a evil attacker and an evil aggressor. I'm just talking about murdering somebody, stealing, lying, coveting what you don't have, and so forth. And I love this. Even as you look at those, as we call them, the 10 Commandments from Exodus chapter 20, what's the most important one of those? Well, that was actually asked to Jesus. Hey, which of those is most important? And he replied in Mark 12, Matthew 22, and in Luke 10, you could actually sum everything up in this. Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. This is where we get our quote-unquote golden rule. Treat others the way you'd like to be treated. We instilled that in our kids at a very early age. Hey, when you do this, this, and that, how would you like to be treated? How would you like somebody to treat your stuff? Okay, that's your game, and the girls are going to play with it today. Hey, girls, how would you like to treat his game when you're done with it? You want to put everything back in the box and put it away? Do you want to tear it apart and shred it and draw all over the pieces and so forth? So again, we start thinking about you're going to borrow that bike, you're going to borrow those rollerblades, you're going to use their swim goggles. Whatever it happens to be, how would you like to be treated? What would you like to do? And start to instill in them that basis. And Jesus was very clear on this. It's an absolute truth. It makes sense, it's logical, it's rational, it's thoughtful. But the relative truth, the person from that oxymoron, says, again, that's fine for you, but I don't even believe in God. So this idea that I'm going to love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and I'll love my neighbor as myself. You know, if you loved your neighbor as yourself, you would honor your father and mother, you would not covet, you would not steal, you would not murder, you would not lie. And so you recognize how those would all flow from that. So, any evidence that God exists when you think about truth? Well, Romans chapter 1 says this, God actually has anger for all those who act ungodly and who suppress his truth. And the next verse says, the knowledge of God, because the knowledge of God is clearly evident within all people, meaning you actually have something inside you that recognizes there's a conscience that makes you stop and think, yeah, I know this. And yet many people choose to negate that and neglect it and be in conflict with it. Verse 20 then says this, I love this statement. Since God's creation of the natural world, God's attributes, his power, his nature, are seen and understood through what he has created. As such, people have no excuse for not believing God exists. And I put this parenthetical statement at the end. It's almost as if he's asking, where do they think all of this came from, right? And so this takes us back to sessions 3 and 4, when we looked at the getting into the planet and so forth in session 2. Was the universe more life in session 3, and then moving over into the beginning of could the Bible have any relevance? And essentially you're saying, wow, we all have no excuse, because looking around we see everything that's created. It shows and exhibits design and purpose and intention. In verse 25, people then did what? They then exchanged the truth, which they should see, about God, for a lie. And they began to do what? They worshiped what God created rather than the God who created it all. And so that becomes the distinction, again, human nature, recognizing that I don't really want to believe in God, so I'm going to worship the things that are created, the planet and so forth, and animals, and make idols and so forth, rather than worship the one who created it all. And that still goes on today. Absolute truth says what? Design, precision, fine-tuning, all of these point clearly to the Creator. It's evident. Go out on the hilltop in the evening and look at all the stars, and you see the moon, and you see the sunset before that, and it's on the water and the colors, and you think about all the plant life, the animal life. You just look at how your body is created and so forth. Holding a new grandson or granddaughter, or when I held my own children and realized, where did this person come from? Pretty amazing. And it's evident, but a lot of people would reject that. Because relative truth says, hey, the natural world came about by random processes, and it just appears to have some exhibiting of design and precision and fine-tuning. But the skeptic says, my perspective and my preference is to not believe that God exists, therefore I have to have that as my basis before I go into looking at anything. And again, think about that. They're a relativist, and yet they already have a rule in place. God doesn't exist. And so yet their relativism kind of falls apart right away. As we come into the home stretch here and close out, the skeptic, this is our fourth dialogue. I think you'll like this one. I start off and say, the Bible and creation seem to make a really strong case for the existence of God. The Bible as specific revelation and the creation as general revelation. Seems to make a pretty good case for that. The skeptic says, well, not for me. I don't believe there's a God who created everything. So again, if you're going to have relative truth, your whole position has just fallen apart again because you've already stated there is no God. So you actually have an axiom, you have an absolute truth on which you're starting your whole process. Do you see that? I respond and say, well, your choice to not believe in God doesn't disprove that he exists. I mentioned this early on in sessions 1, 2, and 3. People are always asking, Dave, can you prove that God exists? And my response, of course, is, yeah, give me time and show you a lot of evidence and so forth. But I also love to say the quick answer, which is, can you prove that God doesn't exist? And again, scientists and atheists and philosophers and so forth on the other side of the skeptics, they don't have a way to disprove that God exists. So your choice to not believe in him doesn't disprove that he exists. In fact, your perception and preference have no impact at all in his existence. It's like standing on the roof of a 20-story building and saying, I don't believe in gravity. Well, you can jump and not believe in gravity. The bottom line is, though, gravity is an absolute truth. You don't have any choice in the matter with that regard. But then they'll say this, but that works for me, Dave. And your belief works for you. I've had many people tell me over the time, I'm really happy for you. I think what you believe in is, that sounds great. I'm glad you, your wife, your kids, your family, etc. But that doesn't work for me. So can we just leave it at that? And that's always interesting because I say, but your preference is then based on your own perceived basis that God does not exist. You've already decided that rule, that basis. In deciding that, that is for you an absolute truth. Therefore, your relativism doesn't hold up. Your choice is then an absolute truth. And once again, it's illogical. It's impossible for relativism to be personal preferences because that actually disproves the whole basis of that position. Let's close with this. The Big Think had an article about a year ago, August of 2022, and the title of the article was, Can Science Ever Discover the Absolute Truth About Reality? And I thought in this very, very thought-provoking article, again, not a Christian article at all, but I did pull this one quote, and this is a word-for-word quote. Listen to this, and think of it carefully now. The human endeavor of science is the ultimate pursuit of truth. That's, again, where science is now a religion. It's science that you worship. It hails back to the comment in Romans. Having rejected the one who created everything, they instead now worship what was created. By asking the natural world and universe questions about itself, we seek to gain an understanding of what the universe is like, what the rules that govern it are, and how things came to be the way they are today. And that statement is couched in relativism and yet kind of violates its own bases because it has stated a couple of absolutes inherently and implicitly within that statement. And I would contrast the big think with the New American Standard Bible. As you take a look at the scriptures, I would put a title similar to the big think, and I'd say, can the Bible be a standard basis for the absolute truth of reality? And this quote is my own. I tried to come up with something that would match pretty closely to what their position was. But I would say this: human existence involves the ultimate pursuit of truth, not science. Human existence is the ultimate pursuit of truth. Could the Bible then be a medium through which mankind can gain an understanding of the purpose of the natural world and life? See, it's no longer natural life and natural world and the creation and so forth as being the thing we're honoring and we're kind of bowing down to, but now we're saying, no, could the Bible then be a medium that would give me some understanding of mankind and the understanding of our purpose of the natural world and life and how things came to be the way they are today? And that's, again, the big discussion we have. Talk about the big think. I think the Bible is a great big think. Gets me thinking about, this is a really old book. This goes all the way back. I think this is from 1979. So yeah, this was a junior year of college. And the book is called Preserving the Person by C. Stephen Evans. And what it does is it looks at the human sciences and from a biblical perspective, a Christian perspective, takes a look at, let's preserve the person. Let's not lose the person in all this as if everything is just natural law, natural order. Oh, by the way, mankind just happened to evolve over time and be at the top of the food chain. No, there is intention and specificity of design and purpose with regard to the person, because we're created in the image of the Creator. We have that additional third component of the pneuma, the spirit. So what are our best takeaways for tonight? Well, by definition, truth is inherently, by definition, it's absolute. That's what makes it truth. So this term relative truth, if you speak with somebody about that, you can tell them right away, well, that's an oxymoron. There's no such thing as relative truth. You cannot be truth subject to or dependent upon circumstances. Culture, perceptions, preferences, changes over time. Societal norms and mores continue to shift over time due to opinions and preferences, but that's just, again, a preference. It's not truth. And yet if you embrace it and try to call it truth under the term of relativism, you've actually undermined your whole argument. Relativism always falls apart by having to claim some type of absolute on the front end. And as soon as you do that, you say, oh, so that's your absolute, that's your basis. So there are some absolute truths, like, oh, do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt others. Well, wait a minute, you just put in a caveat, a disclaimer that is an absolute truth. And if you don't hurt others, you're okay. If you do hurt others, then you're not okay. That becomes, in essence, a definition of an absolute truth. Ethics cannot be subject to opinions or preferences or situations or circumstances. So whether it be the book Moral Mazes or Why Moral Leadership is Good Business, or even looking at the book I did on entrepreneurial ethics, the values and decision-making in successful new ventures and drawing into their minds of these entrepreneurs, it cannot be subject to the circumstances and situation that we're in. The Bible does, however, provide a basis for understanding truth. I gave a few examples this evening, and those are very clear, cut and dry, absolute truths. And the question is, do you approach those as, well, that's fine for you, but it doesn't work for me, in which case you have already, again, put in place an absolute truth that you do not believe in God, you do not, have any basis for believing the Bible has anything to say to you. So here's a quick summary again of what we looked at going in. We're now 5 sessions into our 12 sessions on apologetics. We've looked at worldview, biblical versus naturalistic. We looked at the universe, earth and life, purpose and intent versus random accidental. We talked about, could God communicate both generally through the creation and specifically through the Bible? And yet the other side would say, well, there's nothing to transmit because there is no transmitter or no source. Everything just happened by random. There's no purpose or intent to the universe. We're just looking at the natural outcomes of natural law over billions of years. And when we come to truth then, you can see how diametrically opposed they are. One is saying, well, there is such a thing as absolute truth, no change over time, and yet relative position looks to things like scientific fact, which we already see scientific fact changes over time. And that's kind of an interesting basis for understanding that. For the reading list for this, I always give you resources at each session. These are all books that I have in my library and stuff I've read, so I definitely recommend Art Lindsley's book, True Truth, Defend Absolute Truth in a Relativistic World. That came out about almost 20 years ago. Dennis Dinger's book, The Absolute Truth for a Relative World, really good read. Many of you know Josh McDowell. He has a great book, came out about 12 years ago, called The Unshakable Truth. Abdu Murray has a good book called Saving Truth, and he says the subtitle, Finding Meaning and Clarity in a Post-Truth World. That's only about 5 years ago. I think you'll find that a good read. An older one, going all the way back to, again, my college days, my senior year there, Every Thought Captive, A Defense of Christian Truth by Richard Pratt. Steve Evans, Preserving the Person, I brought that with me this evening. And then Doug Gruthis has The Truth Decay, Defending Christianity Against Postmodernism. And I think that's a really good read. Mike Singer has a book called The Search for Truth. That's almost 50 years old now, and again, still some great bases philosophically in there from the scriptures about that. Two authors, Kelly and Drew, Understanding Postmodernism. You know, we live in a time right now where modernity really brought in the age of science and so forth, and everything was going to be based on that. Now we're actually in a postmodern society. Perry Anderson's book, The Origins of Postmodernity, an excellent read, really helped lay out the groundwork for you of how we get to where we are today in 2023. Lee McIntyre's book, Post-Truth, kind of looks at this new era that we've moved into where there really is no truth. Everything is relative. And I like that because, as a basis, because he's saying there is no truth. We're post-truth because when everything becomes relative, there is no truth. It's all a matter of preference. It's all a matter of societal decisions and perspectives. And then if you wanted to hunt down an old copy, it's no longer in print, of course, but there are some out there on the web used and so forth. You can, if you'd like to read, if you're a business owner or an entrepreneur, you might want to read a little bit about entrepreneurial ethics and see what your fellow entrepreneurs from the Inc. 500 had to say from that window of 1991 to 96. So, next study will be next Monday night, July 24th, and we're going to segue from tonight's session 5 on absolute truth, relative truth, to session 6 with this premise. So if the Bible is true, and we have this idea of relative, absolute truth and so forth, then what about this? Here's a couple of truths to consider. Was there a historic Jesus from Nazareth in the 1st century AD? Did Roman Pontius Pilate have him executed on a cross? And what about the claim that Jesus was resurrected? So I have some great readings for you on that. We're going to look at these 3 main issues. Was there a historic Jesus? We'll look at archaeology and all kinds of other things. Did Pontius Pilate actually have him executed? And what about the claim of his resurrection? And we'll do that when we get together next week on the 24th. So let me pray for us, and then I'll take some questions. Father in heaven, thank you for